Months of military buildup, suddenly turning into an all-out war. Russia launching deadly attacks targeting Ukrainian cities, airports, and even a nuclear power plant. A humanitarian disaster unfolding as the world watches. Men, women, and children suddenly ripped from their normal lives, now living on a battleground. Russia's war on Ukraine taking a deadly toll as leaders from around the world are calling for attacks to stop.
Fighting for democracy.
Imposing strict sanctions meant to put the pressure on Putin, but with that war already happening, he's indicated Russia won't leave until they got what they came for. A list of demands includes giving territory to Russia and a commitment to neutrality. Bringing troops inside Ukraine's borders, demanding the nation distance itself from the Western allies. Ukraine caught in the middle of a superpower tug of war and a fight for its survival. And now we look back at how we got here in the first place. Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm David George. Well, for the last several weeks, news of Russia's invasion into Ukraine has dominated headlines. More than 2 million Ukrainians fleeing the country, according to the United Nations. Yet others are taking up arms to defend their homeland against Vladimir Putin's military attacks. Most leaders around the world are standing behind Ukraine as it fights for its sovereignty. But while the escalation to a full-scale war is sudden, Putin's push to control Ukraine is not. So tonight, we're diving into the history of that region for a better understanding of how we got here in the first place. We're going back more than a century to explore Ukraine's decades-long campaign for independence, despite a history of shared cultural ties and Soviet alignment, making the ongoing challenge for a nation to go on its own way. So let's start by showing you exactly where Russia and Ukraine stand geographically. The two countries share a border more than 1,400 miles long. Their physical proximity to Europe gives European countries a significant interest in minimizing the impacts of war there. And while Ukraine is on Russia's other side, don't forget, the United States is closer to that conflict than you may think. In fact, just 55 miles lie between mainland Russia and Alaska, with the two separated only by the Bering Strait. Ukraine has long been a country pulled between Russia and the West. Proximity to each global power requires a delicate balancing act that many times in history has tipped into bloodshed. The war raging right now in Ukraine is far from the very first time violence has broken out there. And for a better understanding of how we got where we are now, well, we're going back a century. So the Russian Soviet Republic became the world's very first constitutionally guaranteed socialist state, and that was back in 1917. Soviet rule, though, came with a multi-year bloody civil war as secret police executed supporters of the previous leadership in a period known as Red Terror. 5 years later, by 1922, Soviet Russia had found allies, and together they formed the USSR. The Union, Socialist Republics, well, that was established 100 years ago on December 30th, 1922. Russia and Ukraine were both original members, and at its peak, that group comprised of 15 Soviet socialist republics. Having an understanding that many of those areas still have ties to Russia, that can help explain why they may cooperate or turn a blind eye right now, even when most of the world condemns Putin's actions. The USSR lasted for almost 7 decades and spanned more than 8 million square miles before collapsing in 1991. And the Soviet Union was the largest country in the world at the time, a title Russia still holds today. Over its existence, the USSR saw several leaders, notably Joseph Stalin. He was dictator from 1924 to 1953. And under his rule, he changed the Soviet Union from having a society largely based on farming to one of increasing militarization and state control. An estimated 600,000 Soviet citizens were killed in the Green Purge. Also, that took place between 1936 and 1939, and still more were deported or imprisoned in labor camps. For the USSR's agriculture, well, the family farms were consolidated into a series of state-run farms, and Stalin claimed that it would increase productivity, which it did not, but less productive farms were far from the worst under Stalin's rule. So with a drop in farming productivity came the Great Famine for years. The USSR denied the famine was even happening, but now we know that millions died as a result of starvation. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was among the hardest hit, and there the famine was known as Holodomor. In fact, that combines the Ukrainian words for starvation and death. Nearly 4 million people were starved to death, accounting for roughly 13% of the country's population. World War II, well, that began in 1939, which proved to be a major test for the USSR, as it was the nations around the world. But Stalin remained in control for that war, signing an agreement of non-aggression with Germany. And despite that promise, Hitler still launched an invasion into the Soviet territory in 1941, and that was drawing the USSR into the war. Many Soviet soldiers died during the war, but they were able to stop the German advance before it could capture the city now known as St. Petersburg in Russia. During World War II, Germany took control of the Ukrainian Soviet state, occupying it between 1941 and 1944. In this time period, some Ukrainian independence fighters took the side of the Nazis. When the Germans arrived, Ukrainians were starving to death under Soviet oppression, so in that sense, the Nazi arrival was seen as an improvement in conditions by many, despite the atrocities of the Holocaust that we all know were taking place then. Today, Russian President Vladimir Putin has used this to portray modern-day Ukrainians who are in favor of independence as themselves being Nazis. Most historians view this period as Ukrainians choosing between two evils, the Soviets and the Nazis. But don't forget, those independence fighters from 1940s wanted independence, seeking to ultimately be their own nation, not controlled by either Soviets or Nazis. Following World War II, the Soviets regained control of the modern-day Ukraine from Axis powers. Also, a wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and Western powers also began to crumble. The United States, Canada, and European allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949. The NATO alliance was seen as a show of force by the USSR, which in turn consolidated its power under the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Thus began the Cold War.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
It was an era of threats, surveillance, and an arms race between two superpowers that threatened world peace without ever firing a shot. By the Cold War, Stalin had died and the USSR was under new rule. With Nikita Khrushchev as the Soviet premier, many of Stalin's strictest policies were rolled back, and this allowed for a slight Ukrainian revival. In 1954, the Crimean Peninsula was transferred from Soviet Russia to Soviet Ukraine, something that Russia takes issue with even today. During the 1960s and 70s, elite members of the Communist Party became wealthy and powerful, while average Soviets were still left in poverty. And to make life even worse in the USSR, economic sanctions from the West drove oil prices to its lowest in decades, causing huge economic losses for the Republic members of the bloc. Eventually, the USSR faced enough domestic and external pressure that it dissolved in 1991. Now, the leader at the time was Mikhail Gorbachev, and despite efforts to reform the Soviet Union, leaders of Russia and Ukrainian and Belarusian republics agreed to dissolve the USSR as a push for democracy, causing the Soviet republics to become increasingly unstable.
Выборов демократических, чтобы у нас те, кто принимает решения, люди.
Gorbachev was the final leader of the Soviet Union. The agreement dissolving the USSR switched it from one nation made up of republics to a commonwealth of independent states. And it is at that point the new order began. Nations that were once joined as now forcing their own past, but still tied deeply to each other by their shared history. Well, up next, you might have more distinct memories of recent history, a push for independence, quickly turning deadly riots in the streets, what challenges Ukrainian protesters met when seeking distance from their own past and from Russia, their next-door neighbor. Our special report continues, and thanks so much for joining us. Well, after the dissolution of the USSR, Ukraine had accomplished what many living there had been campaigning to achieve for decades: independence. Now its own country, Ukraine was its own nation rather than a part of the Soviet Union. And as a sovereign country, Ukraine struggled for years after joining the free market, but later enjoyed a major economic boom from 2000 to 2008. Well, then it fell victim to the Great Recession alongside the rest of the world. And a couple years later, things took a turn in the right direction as Ukraine saw financial recovery in 2010. But despite economic improvements, a new challenge loomed. Viktor Yanukovych became Ukrainian president in 2010. He campaigned on Ukraine being a neutral state, not picking a side, but showing interest in relationships with both the West and Russia. The country would cooperate with NATO and the European Union, but not join either group. And that kept the peace with Russia, dampening fears that Putin would be provoked by Ukraine strengthening ties with Russia's Western rivals. But many Ukrainians pushed back in favor of a pro-European movement. Now, demonstrators took to the streets demanding stronger integration with the European Union. Instead, the Ukrainian president did the opposite, strengthening economic ties with Russia and pulling away from the EU. Protesters refused to leave. They were attacked by police, then many were jailed as President Yanukovych signed anti-protest laws as an attempt to quiet demonstrators. However, it only served to increase tension. In 2014, nearly 100 protesters were killed as they met security forces in the capital city of Kyiv. The president fled the country amidst the chaos, and lawmakers voted to remove him from office on February 22, 2014. This is known now as the Revolution of Dignity. The very next day, counter-demonstrators took to the streets of Crimea. Crimea, by the way, a peninsula right there in the Black Sea, which the USSR transferred to Ukrainian control about a year ago or more. In fact, it was given to Ukraine after Stalin's death, so quite some time, after a part of the effort to make the USSR members, besides Russia, feel valued. It was a controversial move, as many people living there have ethnic Russian ties. Crimean demonstrators in 2014 were demanding independence from Ukraine because they disagreed with Ukraine aligning itself more closely with the West. Now, a week after the demonstrations began, Russian special forces seized Crimea's parliament, raising Russian flags over the buildings there, and Crimean lawmakers did not push back, replacing the prime minister there with a Russian politician. 97% of the people living there voted to integrate Crimea into Russia, but the push from a separate of Ukraine was not taken kindly by the West.
In 2014, we are well beyond the days when borders can be redrawn over the heads of democratic leaders.
Despite the West supporting Ukraine keeping Crimea, Russian forces had successfully annexed that peninsula just a month after the siege began. Ukraine and the West now seeing Crimea as a violation of international law and going against agreements that Russia had signed, leaving it as a region of Ukraine. Putin and his supporters, though, called it a reunification, taking back a territory that was formerly part of the Russian Empire, and one that is largely ethnically Russian population living there. Well, Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 was met with staunch opposition from the West, much like the invasion that we're seeing right now. The European Union and the United States imposed sanctions on Russia. Canada and other allies joined in as well, and the sanctions targeted officials and other high-ranking or wealthy individuals and even businesses, including travel bans and freezing the assets, causing economic damage and, perhaps more importantly, signaling how seriously other world leaders took Putin's annexation of Crimea. Now, many of the retaliatory measures by the West against Russia and stemming from this time period are still in place today, as both the United States and the European Union remain committed to the sanctions put in place after 2014's annexation of Crimea. So you fast forward to this year. In January, the EU voted to extend sanctions again until at least the end of July, at which point they'll revisit the issue. Not every country is on board with these sanctions, though. Italy, Hungary, Greece, and France are among a handful of European Union members that have called for a review, saying that Europe itself is feeling the impacts of sanctions and doubting how effective they might be in limiting Russia's economy. In 2016, France led a push to gradually lift European sanctions against Russia, but the EU did not end up doing that, instead choosing to keep them in place. The political climate in the United States has shifted drastically multiple times in the last decade, but one aspect of responding to tension at the Russia-Ukraine border has remained consistent. And we'll get into that next, along with the movement that parallels the Crimean protest but has had a much different outcome, setting the stage for a war that's underway right now. Good evening. Our special report continues, and I'm David George. Since the annexation of Crimea, the United States has seen three different presidents swinging back and forth between the Democratic Party in office to Republican and back again. It also saw a time of intense political turmoil surrounding former President Donald Trump's campaign and time in office, creating a sharp divide between his supporters and his critics. Now, despite major administration changes over the last 8 years, U.S. opposition to Russia's actions has remained in some form. At a time of Russia adding Crimea by appropriation, former President Barack Obama was in office, also a part of the initial sanctioning. In December of 2016, he signed an executive order expelling dozens, in fact several dozens of Russian diplomats, locking down 2 Russian diplomatic compounds and further expanding existing sanctions against Putin's Russia. The reasoning behind the executive order was Russia's interference in the 2016 U.S. elections, and that's where former President Donald Trump comes into the picture.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute.
President Trump took office in 2017 and saw Congress enact the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. Now, that imposed additional sanctions on Russia related to election interference and Russia's involvement in Ukraine and Syria. The act made it so the president would need congressional approval to make changes to any sanctions instead of being imposed by executive orders alone. President Trump imposed several more sanctions, though, in 2018 and 2019 through the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act and additionally through executive orders. Now, under President Joe Biden, even more sanctions have taken place, these in response to Russia invading Ukraine directly. And despite years of sanctions, though, Russia has continued its aggression. Outside of Crimea, another area of Russian hostility in Ukraine is found in a region called the Donbas. It's in the eastern side of the country against the border of Russia, and two pro-Russia separatist groups began demonstrations there as well after the former Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted in 2014. Those groups, the Luhansk and the Donetsk, both considered part of the Donbas. An armed conflict there parallels the situation in Crimea. Following that removal of Yanukovych, protest separatists declared themselves two republics, seeking to remove themselves from Ukrainian control. Russia supported the separatists, though eventually agreed to a ceasefire with Ukraine, and that was the Minsk Protocol, signed on September of 2014. That agreement, it only lasted a few months, collapsing for the first time in January of 2015. And then over the next several years, that region has seen periods of fighting, followed by a new ceasefire. And each time, though, the agreement has fallen through. Both sides have violated ceasefires, and tens of thousands of people have died as Russia and Ukraine fight for control of that region. The longest break from fighting was just 6 weeks back in 2016. But the violence, it never stops for long before it begins again. More recently, Russia began a large buildup of military force along its border in the Donbas region, and that was in March of 2021. In the last year, the number of troops has grown. The U.S. government said by late February, before Russia invaded Ukraine, that nearly 200,000 troops had gathered in and around the Ukrainian territory.
It's directly threatening to the whole region. Therefore, we have to be very, very serious, not just about the deterrence, but also about the possibility of defense.
Also, this February, Russian military presence did increase in Crimea and Belarus, another country that borders Ukraine. Additionally, Russia was holding worldwide naval drills in February with ships, support vessels, and aircraft in both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, along with the Black Sea, which, remember, both Russia and Ukraine border. All this signaling Russia was ready to strike when the time came. Now, while many of us are familiar with the Western argument of Ukrainian independence, the Russian message can be a bit harder to understand, even with decades of historical context. So we're looking into Russia's perspective and President Vladimir Putin's own words up next, while he says his war's justified despite global pushback against his actions. In our final segment tonight, we focus on Vladimir Putin's own words. While most of the world is turning against the Russian president, he's pointing to history to justify his war in Ukraine. His logic is best perhaps outlined in an extensive essay that he published in July of 2021, just as he was starting to build those troops to put Russia in position to attack Ukraine. Putin's essay makes it clear that he thinks Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. He points out to the centuries-old cultural ties and the common history of the USSR, saying about Ukraine's independence that one fact is crystal clear: Russia was robbed. Putin explains his frustration with outside interference, saying Western countries directly interfered in Ukraine's internal affairs when they supported the ousting of Russian-favored Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, referencing World War II when Ukrainian freedom fighters aligned themselves with Nazis. Well, Putin says those who collaborated with the Nazis are ranked as national heroes. The Russian president takes issue throughout his essay with Ukraine aligning itself with the West, specifically referencing the deployment of NATO infrastructure in Ukraine. His 2021 writings make it clear that he won't stand for Western involvement in a country he sees as his, saying he will never allow our historical territories to be used against Russia. In Putin's own words, he sees Russia and Ukraine as one people, making Western involvement a deeply personal attack on him rather than the independent decision of a neighbor country. The West, meanwhile, maintains that Ukraine has a right as an independent nation to make its own decisions. And even many Russians don't agree with Putin's logic. A traveling professor from Russia has been at the University of Kansas since last semester, and he says that he's been a critic of Putin's for the last 2 decades, and he's got an interesting analogy for what's happening in Ukraine right now.
So imagine you are in a crowd at a nice restaurant or something, and then some sort of a brash guy comes in and starts smashing things, you know, and everybody's like what do we do with this guy, you know?
Now, most of the world is seeing Russia as the brash guy while siding with Ukraine and calling Ukrainians that stand on their ground heroes. Like President Volodymyr Zelensky saying in a social media video that the Russian attack began, he and other leaders were staying to protect Ukraine. Right now, the war in Ukraine continues. Russian forces trying to take control of more territories while Ukrainian independence fighters look to stop them. Many nations are now part of economic sanctions against Russia in hopes that increasing financial pressure will be enough for President Putin to reverse course. As for what's next, all we can do is wait and see. We're living through a history that our children and grandchildren will learn about in school. However, understanding the roots of this current conflict already lie in our history books. On behalf of producer Anna Christensen, director Trent Spencer, and editor Jared Long, I'm David George. Thanks so much for watching. Stay safe and have a good evening.